So, writers effectively explain or teach their claim and evidence. Your informational essay will be 5 paragraphs. So far, you've practiced writing different types of hooks. You've chosen one of those hooks and written your introductory paragraph. You've also prepared your outline. The outlining work that you've already done is going to become your 3 body paragraphs. So today, while you're writing, I'd like you're going to pause every so often in order to write the sentence or the part that I ask you to. So really quickly, open your notebook to your grammar and craft section and title a fresh page body paragraph number 1. Also have this outline somewhere where you can look at it easily. So the advanced body paragraph looks a little bit different than the regular body paragraph. This paragraph has some more components to it. You will introduce your evidence, write your evidence, and write an explanation twice during this paragraph. Your 2 pieces of evidence should work together to help support your claim, but each piece of evidence should bring something new to your argument or your claim. So we're going to start today with the first transition and the topic sentence. So in order to write my topic sentence, I'm going to look at my outline. And in my outline, my first topic sentence is agricultural practices that are resistant to climate change. My controlling idea is Chad has a number of needs for sustainable development. So I'm going to kind of simplify my topic sentences and just say one of Chad's needs is agricultural practices that are resistant to climate change. So it will look like this. Chad is in need of agricultural practices that are resistant to climate change. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write my transition. So my transition is like an introduction to my topic sentence, and it also is a bridge between my paragraph before and the paragraph that I'm writing now. So since this is my first body paragraph, I'm actually transitioning from my introductory paragraph. So I'm going to transition from the idea that I have all of these needs to one of the specific needs. So this is how I write it. In order to help alleviate some of the effects of poverty, developing sustainable agriculture and livestock is key to helping increase jobs and provide food security for Chad. So in this transition, I'm moving from my big idea to getting more specific into just agricultural practices. So an easy way to do this is to maybe just think about like, what is this impact? How might I move from, how might I just start talking about that impact? I'm going to have you pause right now. And write this part. All right. So let's look at the next thing we're going to do. We're going to introduce our evidence and provide our evidence. So when I introduce my evidence, I want to introduce the author, the title, and any other relevant information. That might include things about the source or the topic or the text of study. You might check out the different types of ways to introduce your evidence below in the Schoology page. And then, of course, when you write your evidence, don't forget your quotes and then the author's last name. If you can't find that author's last name, you can just write the source like UNICEF or UN.org. And then don't forget quotes. Oh, really quickly, after you've written this, make sure to highlight the yellow. You can leave the gray, but highlight the yellow. So I'm going to first pull out my evidence that I chose. You might go back to this sheet and see if these 2 pieces of evidence work well together, and then choose the one that might explain the issue first before you kind of highlight things that they're already doing or what that need is specifically. So my first piece of evidence is recently changes in climate have brought lower rainfalls, and consistent overuse has led to soil erosion and land degradation. Farmers lack infrastructure, support, and resources needed to grow sufficient food. So when I introduce this evidence, I am going to introduce it in this way. So I might say, like, according to the author in his article titled blank, and then I might give you some of that relevant information. Or I might say, in, like, according to the organization, or the author says this in his essay. So this is how I introduce this evidence. So according to Farhanaz Mohammed, in his article titled Poverty in Chad, Mohammed discusses how a changing climate will more severely impact poverty in Chad. So I thought it was really important for you to understand as the reader that Mohammed talks about how climate change is really going to impact poverty, because that will also help me when I write my explanation for you to know that that is an impact of climate change. And I didn't think it was as important to specifically talk about what that was. So right now I'm going to have you pause again and go ahead and write your evidence and introduce that piece of evidence. All right. So let's look at our explanation. So our explanation needs to be 4 to 6 sentences long. Actually, that's not right. For the advanced, your explanation, each explanation should be 3 to 4 sentences long. So it shouldn't be 1 to 2. It should definitely be 3 to 4. And then in your explanation, you are going to describe the evidence in your own words. You might include any additional details, like things from the text that might help you explain your topic sentence, or it might help you explain that evidence and help me understand it. You might teach me a little bit of something, like I might need to understand or know about education in your country, or how healthcare works. Or I might need to understand or learn about climate change. But I should have a really strong understanding of that need that your country has by the end of your explanation. So this is how I explain mine. Mine talks about climate change, so I really have to talk a little bit about the science of climate change. So here's my example. With the rising temperatures and decrease in rainfall, Chadians are at risk of slipping further into poverty. Chad is at risk of both floods and droughts, and climate change will only make matters worse. Drier climates and soil make it nearly impossible to grow the amount of food needed. Since agriculture and livestock farming are the main sources of income from Chad's economy, more arid and increasing climates will affect Chad's ability to make money and provide jobs for its people. So right here, I first talk about the temperatures. I talk about the no rainfall. I talk about how that causes more poverty. And then I talk about like what Chad is actually at risk of, and how it makes it really hard to grow food, right? And then I talk about how, and then I build on that by talking about how, well, Chad really relies on this for their income and for money. And so without this, they're in really, really deep trouble. So it's really important that I add all of those parts in here so that I can really explain this piece of evidence. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to transition to my second piece of evidence. So remember that your transition is building a bridge. You're building a bridge between your first piece of evidence and your second piece of evidence. It can be a really simple sentence, but it should connect the two ideas. So this is how I do it. Despite these conditions, right, the conditions of the temperatures and the decrease in rainfall, some farmers are trying on creative solutions. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. I'm going to talk about those creative solutions. First, I talk about the conditions, then I talk about the solutions that are being used. Then I'm going to go through that process again. I'm going to give my, actually, you know what? I totally forgot to have you pause. So I'm going to have you pause. I'm going to have you write your explanation, and I'm going to have you write your transition sentence. So go ahead and do that right now. Okay. So now I'm going to do this process again. I'm going to introduce my evidence, provide my evidence, and write my explanation. I'm going to kind of go through it quicker this time, so I'm going to go through all three of those at once. This is the way that I'm going to introduce my evidence. I am going to introduce it in a different way than I did before. The first time I did it this way, according to blank in an article titled blank. This time I'm going to say the author's name in the name of his article states, describes, or argues. So the reason that I'm doing a different type of introduction to my evidence is because you need to vary it a little bit. Please do that in your writing. So Hakeem Abdi, in his article, Chad is the country most vulnerable to climate change, here's why. Abdi discusses the impact of climate change on Chad and ways in which Chad can continue looking forward. So it's super important for you to understand in my next piece of evidence how Chad is continuing to work from a place of having problems with climate change. And then this is my evidence. So farmers in Chad's semi-arid Sahelian zone have been using a technique called Zai to successfully grow crops, particularly when there isn't much rain. You might notice that I have a ... here. That's because I omitted some words. I decided that those words were not as important, so I left them out. You can also do that in your evidence if you need to. Notice how this piece of evidence is really different. My first piece of evidence supports my claim because it talks about the need that it has, right? It talks about the need that it has for these agricultural practices. My second piece of evidence talks about one of the ways that they're already starting to adapt. And then in this way, I can now talk about how they're starting to adapt, but they need more ways to adapt. So this is how I explain this evidence. I'm going to talk a little bit differently than I did in the first one, of course. So although Chad is facing many challenges, there are ways to ease the effects of climate change. So that's how I'm kind of explaining what they're doing to ease that effect. So farmers in Chad have started using an indigenous rainwater harvesting technique called Zai. In this technique, farmers dig small pits to catch water and allow compost to concentrate. So here I'm really teaching you and explaining to you what Zai farming is. Because you wouldn't know what Zai farming is if I was just to tell you they're using Zai farming. I really have to explain what that means to you. So later, farmers sow crops into the pits. This technique allows farmers to increase their yields by up to 500%. So now I'm telling you how beneficial Zai farming is. And then Chad still suffers from other effects of climate change and needs more techniques like Zai to help them. So in the end of my evidence, I talk about what they're still suffering from and how they still need help. So I'm going to have you pause right now. I'm going to have you introduce your next piece of evidence, write your evidence, and write your explanation. All right, let's look at our last sentence. So our last sentence is our concluding sentence. We're going to use this to wrap up our idea of the paragraph and connect it back to your controlling idea. So how does this paragraph support the larger argument? So our larger argument, right, my larger argument for this is Chad has a number of needs for sustainable development. So I kind of want to come back to that idea in some way. I also want to make sure that I'm talking about these yields. I want to talk about the poverty, right? I want to talk about all those things in this one last sentence. So this is how I do it. Chad is in desperate need of support. So there you go. Right first part, I go right back to my controlling idea. So they're in desperate need of support in helping find more sustainable agricultural practices. That's all the way back to my topic sentence. And this is why they need it. They need practices that can help yield crops despite rising climates and decreased rainfall. So this is how I wrap up my last idea. So I realized that I forgot this part. So more sustainable practices like Zai farming that can help yield crops despite rising climates and decreased rainfall. So I'm going to have you pause. I'm going to have you write your concluding paragraph, your concluding sentence. Make sure that you include all of these parts. Make sure they're all numbered and highlighted. When you finish, maybe have a teacher check in with you to make sure that everything is looking good And then you can move on and maybe use this video to write paragraphs 2 and paragraph 3. Good luck!